Well, good morning and welcome to today's webinar looking at pay structures. My name is Tim Kellett and I'm from Paydata. And I'd like to introduce my colleague Joe Price, also from Paydata. He's one of our lead consultants. And as I said, today we're here to talk to you about pay structures and developing effective pay structures. And just a little bit of logistics first of all. We've got some great, interesting slides for you, which we'll send out to all those who are attending today. We're recording today's session as we're conscious people like to share this and aren't sometimes able to make it on the day as well. If you've got any questions as we go through, there's a Q&A button, and what we'll do is we'll hold those questions until the very end. Today's webinar is due to finish at 11, so it's a hard stop at 11. So if we've not managed to answer any questions by 11 o'clock, we will answer those and send those out with the slides to everyone who's attended as well. So just a little bit of context in terms of how we've got to today. Obviously we work with a lot of organizations, helping them to find and attract, retain and engage the right sort of talent to meet their corporate objectives. So we are a reward management consultancy. We work with a lot of organizations in terms of their pay benchmarking, their overall approach to reward with the reward strategy, looking at how they sort of evaluate jobs and assess job size, which is an important part of pay structure work. We help people through their whole pay review process and their pay review cycle. That involves sometimes helping to create pay structures through our pay modeling and pay structure service. We obviously look at internal relativities in terms of equal pay audits, and we also do a lot of research and insights and provide regular sort of reward surveys as well. And just through all of that research and insights, what we found in terms of this year's pay awards for a lot of organizations, it's been a lot more complex, much more of a complex beast than normal, and that's because there's a lot of different sort of plates to spin in terms of this year's pay awards. So there's that whole thing around pay equity, internal pay consistencies and pay relativities. That's an important part. I think a lot of people look at pay structures or creating a pay structure because they want to look at retaining key staff and key talent. I think obviously the sort of senior management are looking at costs going up, and so affordability is also another key element in that. And then how do you bring in the external benchmarking data that someone like us would provide as well? So there's a lot of different sort of elements have come into the pay review process, and I think going forward, a lot of organizations who don't have a pay structure are thinking, well, actually, would this help us make more consistent and affordable and competitive pay decisions going forward, really? So I think that's the sort of context behind where we've seen a lot of people get in touch about this and want to talk to us about that. So, as I said, I'm pleased that we've got my colleague Joe Price here, who works with a lot of organisations in this area, and so Joe's going to talk today about this, and I'll hand over to you now, Joe, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you, Tim, and good morning, everybody. So, in terms of what we're going to look at today, so this is just a high-level view of the things that we're going to cover. So we're going to look at how to ensure the pay structure aligns with organizational and employee needs. We'll then look at the main types of pay structures and the pros and cons of each, and which types of structures are suited to which types of organizations. We'll look at the role of job evaluation, because it does play a very important role. We'll then look at determining the appropriate market alignment. So we'll discuss, well, what does that actually mean? What does market alignment mean? And we'll look at how you can determine the appropriate market alignment for your organization. And we'll also talk about managing pay progression. So the approach that we use when we're helping customers to develop a pay structure, and therefore the approach we would recommend, you can see on your screen now. So essentially, it consists of three main phases. You have what we refer to as the discovery phase, the design phase, and the delivery phase. And then each of those phases consists of two main steps. So if we look at the discovery phase, first of all, research and analyze, essentially what this phase is about researching and analyzing relevant information to obtain insights, insights on things like the organization's needs, employees' needs, and also the context within which the organization operates. And it's really important. Those insights are really, really, really important, because when you get to the design phase, which is obviously the next phase, when you start to create the pay structure, you're making those design decisions based on data, based on insights. So it provides strong foundations for the decisions that you make, and it will ultimately lead to better outcomes. Now, quite often we see organizations want to jump straight to the design phase. And, we see this quite a lot. They jump straight to the design phase. They want to start creating the pay structure straight away without doing the discovery. And inevitably, what ends up happening in those situations is that a lot of their design decisions will be based on assumptions or guesswork. And actually, that doesn't provide solid foundations for the pay structure. Any pay structure built on assumptions is likely to be less effective and less efficient. Which is why we strongly advocate and strongly believe in the discovery phase. It's about research and analysis of some key elements. And I'll come back to this in a few minutes' time. We're going to talk about these things in a bit more detail. But it's about coming to the design phase armed with those insights, armed with that data, so that you can make appropriate and robust design decisions for your pay structure. So I would encourage you, if you are thinking about following this webinar, if you're looking at your pay structure at the moment, either redeveloping your existing pay structure, or you might not have anything in place and you're developing a new one, this is the process I'd suggest you follow, and start with the discovery phase. And we will talk about these in a bit more detail, so you'll have a bit more information on them. Now, once you can see in the design phase there's a step around create. So what you're doing there is you're choosing the type of pay structure. You're thinking about are you going to have pay ranges, what the width of those pay ranges, it's all of those sorts of things. And essentially, when you move on to the next steps, which is about test, you've essentially, I suppose, got like a draft pay structure to test. And this is a really, really important step. And again, it's another step that sometimes is either missed or maybe doesn't get the time that it deserves. So quite often people, or organizations, should I say, will, they'll do some basic financial modeling of their pay structure, of their proposed pay structure. But it needs to be deeper than that. You really need to be thinking about different scenarios. You need to be thinking about the wider impact beyond the financial impact. So what's the organizational impact? You need to be thinking or getting feedback from employees and from managers. And we'll look at this later on in the session, but testing it is really important, because your pay structure ultimately, your pay bill is probably one of your biggest costs, if not your biggest cost. So when you're developing a pay structure, the impact is huge, and you want to make sure that it's rigorously tested. But it's more than just a financial impact. There's an emotional impact as well, because pay and pay structures, employees are emotionally attached to these things. And, first of all, pay provides financial stability for people, but it can also demonstrate to employees that the organization values them. It provides them with things like pay progression and career progression. So there's an emotional attachment too. So to implement a pay structure without getting feedback from employees is probably not recommended. So again, the test step is often missed out, and quite often what people do is they'll jump from create to implement. But again, I'd really advocate and highlight the importance of testing your structure. Obviously, then once we've got through the design phase, we've created it, we've tested it, we've got it signed off, we're happy with it, we're then through to implementation. And implementation is all about, your project plan, your communication plan. It's about, measuring it to make sure that the pay structure is meeting the desired outcomes. And if not, do you need to make any adjustments? So it's all of those things that you can imagine. And obviously, once the pay structure is implemented, that it doesn't stop there. You don't put it in and then forget about it. You need to be constantly monitoring it to make sure that it continues to do what you want it to do. Also, organizations and businesses, they're constantly changing. So you need to make sure that as the business and organization changes, the pay structure still remains relevant. So it's a continuous cycle, really. You want to be monitoring. It's about continuous improvement. So those are the in terms of developing a pay structure, that's our recommended approach, our recommended process: discovery, design, delivery. Now we're going to look at each of these in a little bit more detail. So in terms of the discovery phase, so during the discovery phase, it's crucial to research and analyze data to gain comprehensive insights into three key areas. So you've got one area is organizational needs, one area is employee needs, and one area is context. Now, what you can see on the screen there under each of those headings, that's just some suggestions. It's not an exhaustive list, but those are some of the key things that I would encourage you to research and analyze and gain a deep understanding about. So if we look at organizational needs, first of all, you've obviously got, strategic objectives to strategy. You want to, when you're developing a pay structure, you need a deep understanding of what the organization is trying to achieve. What are its long-term goals? But also you need to understand things like, well, what talent are we going to need in order to deliver those goals? And do we have that talent now, or are we going to have to go and get that talent in the future? And that's all about as well understanding about what markets you're competing in for that talent, because that's going to influence the type of pay structure that you have. So some organizations could be operating in, a narrow range of talent markets, and other organizations could be operating in a much broader range of talent markets. And we'll talk about the different pay structures after, but there's slightly different pay structures that would suit those two things. Another thing that you really want to understand is the key drivers of business success. Clearly, in most businesses and most organizations, finance is a key driver of success. It's what enables, organizations to continue operating sustainably over the long term, but it's not the only thing. There are many, many other things. So to give you an example, some organizations, individual performance is a key driver of success. In other organizations, it will be team performance. In other organizations, it will be project completion. In other organizations, it will be collaboration, quality, innovation, expertise. You really want to understand those things, because as part of your design, as part of the design phase, you'll be asking yourself questions. Okay, if we know the key drivers of success, how can we potentially support that through the pay structure? How can we align people, with certain behaviors, should I say drive certain behaviors around collaboration, around innovation? How can we incentivize those sorts of things? So that's why it's important to understand that. Obviously, budget constraints is important. You need to know at the outset really what is and isn't affordable. Culture and values, again, a good understanding of the culture of the organization and the values of the organization. Now, most organizations will have stated values, but we work with a lot of organizations, and we'll go in and we'll ask, well, can you describe the culture to us? And actually, a lot of organizations struggle, or you get a lot of different responses depending on who you speak to. And there's actually no definition around the organizational culture. I mean, it's important to understand as an organization what your culture is, or at least what culture you're trying to foster, because the pay structure can also support that. So in an organization where collaboration is important, where teamwork is important, and interdependence is important, and there really is like everybody's interdependent on each other. It's less about the individual and more about the collective. Then perhaps individual performance related pay system might not be appropriate. So again, it's these sorts of questions that you want to, it's this information that you need and the questions you need to be asking yourself to help with the design decisions. Next, we move on to employee needs. So this is about understanding employee expectations, preferences, motivators, retention drivers. What do they want? What do they expect? What motivates people. Now that will vary, of course it will, but you'll also be able to, there'll also be some key trends. You want to basically understand, okay, well, if you send out a survey, for example, and you're wanting to find out about employee motivators, you can analyze the information that you get back, and you can probably identify some key things that won't motivate everybody, but will motivate a large proportion of the workforce. It's about understanding that. Now, employee needs, you can get that information, there's information available from things like engagement surveys, exit interviews, all of those sorts of things. But if you don't have that information and you want to know what employees want, what their preferences are, ask them. Just create a survey, and you might create one survey that covers a few different areas, or you might want to do some shorter pulse surveys. You might want to run some focus groups. You might want to run some one-to-one interviews, but just ask them. A lot of organizations, make assumptions about what they think employees want. And then we'll say to them, well, how do you know that? And have you asked them? And they'll say no. So, it's that straightforward. Just ask them. So that's employee needs. And then, of course, context is important too. So this is about understanding the context within which the organization operates. This is about industry trends and benchmarks. Now, the one thing I would say about benchmarks is that whilst it's useful to know what other organizations do, that, and it can often serve as a starting point. What works in one organization won't always work in another organization, even if you're in the same sector, in the same city, for example, because of the other things that we've looked at there. The culture and values can vary greatly by organizations, and the objectives and employee wants and needs. So benchmarks are important, but don't let that be the driver for what you do. Don't say, oh, well, our competitors over there are doing this, that works for them, it must work for us. It doesn't work like that. Of course, there's the economic conditions, and more recently, as you will have known, obviously, I saw this morning that inflation is down, but it had been quite high over the past sort of few years, and that obviously had an impact on expectations around pay and pay rises, and what employees wanted, and what they, if they weren't getting it, they were looking elsewhere. So it's looking at that sort of stuff. And then, of course, there's the legal requirements. It needs to make sure that there's you're meeting things like your equal pay obligations and all of those sorts of things. So that's the context. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, but it just hopefully gives you an idea of things that you should be researching and analyzing in order to draw insights. Now, it's impossible to meet every organizational employee need perfectly. There are always trade-offs to consider. There always will be. It's the nature of designing anything, really, and the pay structure is no different. There's always trade-offs. However, by being armed with insights, you can make informed decisions that balance these needs effectively, and aid the design process of the pay structure. So ultimately, if you do this, it will help you when you get to the design phase, which brings us on to the design phase. So the first step is around create. So essentially what you want to do in this step is you want to assess the main pay structure choices, and we're going to go through those in a minute. You want to select the most appropriate structure based on the needs of your organization, the needs of your employees, and the context. And then you want to personalize the structure accordingly, again, based on the needs of the organization, of employees, and the context. So essentially that's the sort of the things that you need to do. Now, in terms of the main pay structure choices, you can see them on your screen now. These are the main ones. There are variations of these. There are hybrid versions, but these, by and large, are the main ones. So essentially what you've got is spot rates, something that we call a pay ladder. You've got narrow grades, you've got broad grades, and you've got job families. And we're going to look at these. We're going to look at these now. So in terms of spot rates then, so this system essentially consists of a load of different spot rates for each job. So essentially each job has a fixed rate of pay. So you can see on the diagram there that, job A, or, all people in job A paid 30,000, all people in job B paid 35,000, all people in job C paid 25,000, all people in job D paid 34,000, all people in job E paid 40,000. It's a fixed rate of pay, but for each job. And those fixed rates of pay, those spot rates, are usually based on market data. Okay, so they're usually created using market data. Quite often people will base them on the median, because the median is generally accepted to be the market rate, although you have to be careful with that because there's no such thing as a definitive market rate. But it's generally accepted that the median is, it provides a good reference point, I suppose, as to the typical salary in the market. So quite often people will base it on the median, but you don't have to. Affordability is a key aspect in developing any pay structure. And if you want a spot rate structure, but it's not affordable to pay the median, then you might need to go to a lower position than that. And then you might offset that with some other rewards. We're not going to talk about other rewards at the moment, but sometimes if you go with a lower market position, but you can offer, great learning and development opportunities or other things, then you can offset a lower market position. But more often than not, people will go with the median. Now, this type of pay structure may be suited to organizations that want a market-driven approach, because the spot rates are normally always based on market data. It is a market-driven approach. And for that reason, people like it because they view it as providing them with the flexibility to pay what they need to pay in the market. Want a simple pay structure? Well, it's pretty simple, isn't it? Each job has its own spot rate based on market data. I don't think it gets much simpler than that. It's obviously very transparent. The spot rate is the spot rate. There's no variation from that. And again, consistent, no variation from that. So that's, some of the thing, that organizations that are looking for those sorts of things, it might be a structure that you choose. Now, I guess that there are a few, as with everything, there's pros and cons with every approach. Because the spot rates are normally always based on market data, it puts a hell of a lot of pressure on the market data. You need to make sure that you've got robust and reliable market data for every role. And do you know what? Sometimes that's not realistic, because quite often roles will be similar organization to organization, but every organization has some roles that are unique to its own organization. So sometimes benchmarking can be a challenge with some of those sorts of roles. Some sectors as well, they're a bit more niche. So, market data can be harder to come by. So, it does require, robust and reliable market data for every role. And it puts a lot of pressure, therefore, on the market data. And what you might find is, because the market is constantly changing and it's generally only going one way, you do see some drop-offs, but it's generally only going one way. You might find yourself continuously, looking for market data, analyzing that market data, and making adjustments to those market rates. So I suppose that whilst it is a simple pay structure in one aspect, it can actually be potentially less simple in other ways, I guess, so it's just something to be aware of, that you might, a lot of people say, oh, it's simple, but actually when the realities of the situation might mean that actually it's not as simple as you might realize at first.
It's a bit more volatile, isn't it? I suppose,
It
in a way,
is, yeah. And you're
susceptible to the market data,
exactly, you're taking, yeah, exactly, that's exactly right, Tim. And another issue with this type of structure is that it's perfectly legitimate to use market data to justify pay differences. That's absolutely fine. But that doesn't mean it won't cause you problems, because you might have two jobs that are essentially similar in terms of their value. So if you were to run them through a job evaluation system, they'd actually come out sort of as equal value. And one gets paid more than the other. Now, the person or the people in the role that gets paid less, they might look at the other role and think, well, they're getting more money than us, but in terms of our internal value, in terms of what we contribute internally, I don't see a difference. Yes, I know that there is a difference in the market, but actually, in terms of our internal value, I don't think that's fair. And there's no right and wrong to this; it's all perceptions. But what that might do is it might cause you, morale issues and engagement issues, or people might look elsewhere. They might look for an organisation that doesn't operate spot rates, that operates one of the other structures that we're gonna come on to talk about. So there are, as with anything, there's always things to consider, always things to be aware of. But it's still a very effective type of structure in the right context and right situations. So that's spot rates essentially. I mean, some people might argue that spot rates isn't a type of pay structure. I think it is. It's the reason they say that is because it doesn't have any grade underpin. We're going to now look at the rest of the structures that we look at are underpinned by grades, but it's still a systematic way of managing pay and structuring pay. So I do think it is a pay structure. So the next structure that we have is what we refer to as a pay ladder. This is sometimes referred to as a pay spine. Now, these are, if anybody's ever worked for a local authority, or, they used to be quite common and quite popular in, local authorities. And then they sort of got really bad reputation, and people didn't really ever think about considering them because of that. But I think, again, in the right situations and circumstances, a pay ladder can be okay. And essentially what you've got is you've just got a big ladder of pay points. You can see there on the diagram, pay point 1, 2, 3, 4, and it just keeps going up. And then attached to those pay points, you've got grades. So, let's just say that bottom one there is grade 1, then it's grade 2, grade 3. Well, you can see that each of those grades consists of a series of pay points. And typically what used to happen was, people would come in at the bottom pay point, and then after a year's service, they'd move up to the next pay point. So it was very much service led. Now, a modern take on the pay ladder is you can actually make progression up those pay points contingent. You could have a performance threshold, for example, so it doesn't become automatic. I think that was people's main issue with this type of structure, that, they didn't believe in service-based pay progression. And you can actually make it contingent on performance. You can actually turn those pay points into skills blocks that can become contingent on skills. So you can actually, there's a modern approach, I think, to this type of structure. So it could be suitable, could be appealing, should I say, to some organizations. Now, this type of pay structure may be suited to organizations that want a clear and direct framework within which to manage. It's pretty clear and direct, isn't it? These are the pay points this is your grade, these are the pay points. It's either based on service or something else. It's pretty clear and straightforward. Sometimes when organizations, they might have a public sector background or culture, so maybe a sort of like a housing association perhaps, or have a strong trade union. So those are some of the characteristics that of organizations that it might be suited to. So what I would say about pay ladders is that it's certainly worth considering. It might not be right for you, but don't discount it straight away. Kind of look at it and think, okay, does this give us what I need? So that's a pay ladder. The next structure is what we refer to as narrow grades, and essentially a narrow graded structure consists of 10 or more grades. So there's usually quite a lot of grades. Obviously, the number of grades will vary based on the size of the organization, but usually there's sort of 10 or more. And then attached to each grade, there'll be a pay range. And in a narrow graded structure, the pay range widths usually range from about 20 to 50% wide. Again, that's one of your design decisions. If you wanted to go down the route of a narrow graded structure, one of the design decisions that you'd have to make is around pay range width. Now, each of the grades, so you can see there on the diagrams, like steps, isn't it? Now, each of those grades contains jobs of equal value. So all jobs in the same grade, essentially broadly the same value. So if you were to put them through a job evaluation scheme, they'd sort of come out as the same with a points range that would place them in the same grade or level. I use the terms grade and level interchangeably, by the way. So they'd be the same grade or level. So basically, what that means is that each grade contains jobs of equal value, essentially. And so with the pay ranges, what you're doing here is, when you're creating the pay ranges, you're using market data. So you are still using market data to create the pay ranges, but because you're using lots of different market data, you're aggregating the data to create an overall pay range for each grade. What ends up happening inevitably is that the ranges become a bit more generalized rather than being specific to each individual role. So if you think back to spot rates that we were looking at a minute ago, that market data was specific to each of those roles. What you've got here is you've got market data, or different market data from different sources for different roles being used to create an overall pay range. So you can see that there's a reference to the market, but it's not specific as it was for spot rates. Now, because each grade contains jobs of equal value, this type of structure is suited to organizations that value internal equity, want to primarily reward job size. I say primarily because there still is market data being used, but the focus here is more towards job size and internal equity rather than the market. Want to provide some but not too much scope for pay progression, because inevitably narrow grades, narrow ranges, and have many jobs or layers of hierarchy. So those are some of the key sort of characteristics that for organizations that it may suit. Now, the one thing I would say with this is that, of course, if you've got pay ranges that are more on the general side, you might have some roles where the top of their range is close to or below the market median salary for their role. If you were to look at an individual benchmark for their role, that can cause problems. So it can sometimes hinder your ability maybe to attract certain types of roles. I'm going to use IT as an example, but quite often IT, the salaries are quite high, and therefore they, if you are using this structure for all your roles, they may be at or near the top of the ranges. Now, what some organizations choose to do in that scenario is they might use market supplements or market allowances to overcome that problem, because they might say, well, internal equity is very important, we want to reward job size, but there are certain roles where the structure isn't quite working for us, therefore we're going to use market supplements. Or, and we're going to come on to talk about job families after, they might go down the job family route. So again, there's key considerations to think of whenever you're looking at any of these structures. But essentially, this is more about rewarding job size and more about internal equity, which brings us on to our next structure, which is broad grades. So you can see from the diagram there that there's less grades. In a broad graded structure, there's typically 6 to 8 grades, although it will depend on the size of the organization. Now, what happens in a broad graded structure is actually each of those grades contains jobs of different sizes. So essentially, if you think back to the narrow grades that we were just looking at, each broad grade might contain the equivalent of 2 or 3 narrow grades, for example. So you're starting to collapse the narrow grades into broader grades. Now, again, there's no right and wrong about how many kind of narrow grades you would collapse into each broad grade. The minimum, of course, would be 2. But you could have the equivalent of 2, 3, 4. Again, it's the design decision that you need to make. But inevitably, what you end up with is with grades of multiple, consisting of jobs of multiple job sizes. So you can see that now we're starting to come away from job size and internal equity, and what we end up with is a bigger pay range. So the pay ranges in a broad graded system typically, and again, this is a design decision, but they'll typically be 30 to 60% wide. They could even be higher than 60% wide. Now, what ends up happening, therefore, in this type of structure is you probably won't, depending on how many sort of equivalent, how many different sized jobs you've got in each grade, you probably won't use the pay ranges the same way as you would in a narrow graded structure. In a narrow graded structure, typically what tends to happen is if somebody's new to a job, they'll join at the bottom of the range and then they'll progress through that range either based on experience or performance or whatever it might be. In this type of structure, because you've got different sized jobs, it would be unrealistic to actually bring all of those jobs in at the bottom of the range. You probably wouldn't be able to attract and retain for some of those jobs. So what the range has become in a broad graded structure is it's a bit more of a safety net. They provide the parameters at each grade, but pay decisions, so there's a couple of ways that you can do this. You can either introduce sub-ranges, which some organizations do. So, they might divide it, they might split it in half and have a range for each half, or thirds, depending on the size of the range. Or they use reference points, which actually are similar to spot rates. So they might have reference points for clusters of jobs to help, determine where you might start a new starter. So basically, you're having to introduce different pay management techniques with broad grades than what you apply with narrow grades, I suppose. Now, I would argue that if you've got broad grades and you're using sub-ranges, so let's say you've got like broad grades consisting of like 2 or 3 equivalent narrow grades and you've got sub-ranges, then what's the difference between that and using narrow grades? You might as well use narrow grades. So what we, a bit of a false economy in that sense. So this type of structure at first glance can be quite appealing to a lot of organizations because they think, oh, great, we don't want the sort of like, we don't want all those grades. We think it's a bit old fashioned, a bit overly bureaucratic. We nice and simple, we're a flat structure, so on and so on. Let's go broad grades. But then when it comes to actually managing pay review time, they realize that they need more controls in place because otherwise it just becomes very difficult and they have a whole host of other problems. So actually you end up with sub ranges almost putting in stealth narrow grades anyway. So I think that if you are going to use broad grades, it's probably better to use reference points, I suppose. So this type of pay structure may be suited to organizations, again, that value external competitiveness, because as you see, we moved away, haven't we, from internal equity, and we're now, especially if we're using reference points, we're now thinking really about the market value of the role. Of course, the ranges are bigger, so there's more scope for pay progression. So this might be suited to an organization that has really aggressive growth targets, and they're happy, providing people are overachieving to offer some quite generous increases, and therefore, again, it's about, if you think back to what we were talking about before, in terms of making these design decisions or choosing the right structure, that's about the strategy, isn't it? If you've done your discovery and that there's like some really stretching targets, and you might, and it's going to be all about individual performance, then this might be a structure that suits your organization. And again, it might suit organizations that have fewer jobs, layers of hierarchy. So that's broad grades. Now, I would say that the two most common structures that we either tend to see or tend to implement tend to be the narrow grades or broad grades, probably closely followed by job families, which is the next structure that we're going to look at. So job families essentially, basically they consist of different sets of ranges, if you like, because basically there's different groupings. Now again, this is a design decision. It's different. It varies by organization. You know, the families will depend on the organization, but you can see in this example, this is just two families, but we have a commercial family and an engineering family. Now the commercial job family is for commercial roles, and the engineering family is for engineering roles. Now in job family, you can in theory decide to use, it could either be underpinned by broad grades or narrow grades, but in reality, people or organizations tend to use narrow grades because of what I was talking about before. It provides a sweet spot between internal equity and external competitiveness, because what you've got is you've got groupings of jobs that are very similar, and then you've got your grades of equal value, but each family, the pay ranges for each family are created using market data that is specific to that family. So do you remember I was saying before about narrow grades, the ranges become a bit generalized? Well, this is a way of getting around that. You could have an IT family, you could have a HR family, you could have again, it's about depending on what's right for your organization. And for each of those families, you use market data that is relevant to that family. So what you end up having is you have ranges that are relevant to that market and that group of jobs, but you're also ensuring internal equity within each family. So as I said, I describe it as almost like the sweet spot between internal equity and external competitiveness, which is why a lot of organizations find this type of structure quite appealing. There are other reasons why it might suit your organization. You know, you might operate in a diverse range of markets. Again, do you remember what I was saying before around the strategy and, you know, what talent's needed, what markets you're operating in? If you're operating in really diverse markets, a single structure probably isn't going to work. You're going to need to have multiple structures, which is essentially what job families is. You have a diverse range of operating models. You want a framework that clearly defines career paths within each family. Again, you know, this is a really useful structure because not only do you have pay ranges that are unique to each group of jobs, to each family, but you can then have career paths and career steps that are unique to each family. So again, it's appealing from that perspective. Of course, you know, sometimes when organizations, you know, if they merge or if one organization buys another organization, inevitably you might have quite different cultures. And again, that can, you know, this type of structure can be quite appealing. So it's, you know, there's lots of advantages of job families, but I guess some of the key considerations are it is more complex. You know, you're going from having one structure to multiple structures, and inevitably, you know, setting that up and the maintenance of that and the administration of that is probably more intense than it is with the other types of structures. There's
Joe,
also
so I was going to say, yeah, we work with some organisations like which are quite not for profit almost, but they have quite a commercial, you know, maybe a commercial function, an area which is, you know, quite commercial and perhaps needs to be treated differently. Presumably, you know, would this suit that sort of? So as you say, you got sort of multiple cultures there, almost different objectives depending on the types of role.
Absolutely, Tim. So yeah, no, it's a good point. So as you know, we work with a lot of housing associations, don't we? And a lot of housing associations do their own development these days. And the market that they're competing in for talent, well, it is other, you know, is the other development function housing associations, but they're also sometimes attracting and retaining people from private house builders. So it could be that they have a development so, you know, they have one family covering, you know, their traditional housing association roles. One family may be covering business enablement roles like HR and finance, and then one family covering the development roles. And the market data that's used to create the ranges for the development family could be a mix of housing association data and private house builder data. What you can also do is, if, you know, again, this is a design choice, but you can also have a different market position. So, you know, they could choose to have a higher market position for those development roles if they wanted. So all of the other ranges could be based on the median, but they could choose an upper quartile position, for example, for their ranges for the development family, provided it's affordable. And you can also have different reward arrangements. I'm not going to talk too much about bonuses and stuff, but you can have, if you've got different families, some families, you could, in this example here, this commercial family, let's assume that it's, full of commercial roles, sales roles, and those types of roles, they could have a lower base pay position, but a much higher variable pay position, whereas the engineering family could have no variable pay at all and just a solid base pay position. So you can mix and match with the market position and the different rewards that are available to each family. But again, one thing to be aware of is that whilst that will help, maybe attract and retain and motivate employees, you need to make sure that you're very effective in your communication of all of that. Because if you're not, what will happen is employees in some families that don't get the bonus or whatever it might be will say, well, why are they getting the bonus? So you need to be transparent. You need to be clear on why. And, usually with effective communication, most employees get it, but don't leave them guessing, because that's when they start to mistrust and so on. So again, key consideration, I guess, around job families is not only is it a bit more complex, but that you have to be very aware around the communication and the education for employees and so on. So that's job families, and that brings us to the end of this part. So I've got other things to talk about, but those are the main types of pay structures. So when you're looking at each of those, and you're armed with your insights from your discovery phase, you'd be asking yourself some of the questions that we were talking about. But so it's what's going to suit our organization, what's going to suit our objectives, what's going to suit our culture, what do employees want, and that will help you sort of determine which structure would be right for your organization. So next we've got this just very quickly, because I'm just conscious of time. So we've got the role of job evaluation. So these are some of the key considerations that on top of choosing the structure. These are some of the other key considerations you need to be thinking about. I would say that if most organizations need some form of job evaluation. Most organizations of a certain size need some form of job evaluation. If you're looking at any of the implementing any of the pay structures that we've just looked at, I do think you need a job evaluation underpin. And then you've got a choice to make between analytical job evaluation and non-analytical job evaluation. Now, the reason I say that I believe you need a job evaluation underpin is that bar spot rates, all of those structures consisted of grades. So to make grading decisions, you need a way to make grading decisions. You can't just say, oh, this job belongs to this grade, because it's not, that's not a robust process. So job evaluation helps you make those grading decisions in a robust and consistent way. Now you might be saying, well, why do we, if we're using spot rates, why do we need job evaluation? Well, not only can job evaluation help you grade jobs, but it can also help improve the accuracy of market benchmarking. Because spot rates is obviously based on market data, it's heavily reliant on market data. It's heavily reliant on accurate market data. If you evaluate all of your jobs, you can then ensure that the market data that you use is for similar sized jobs. So whilst you might not be in a spot rate system, you might not be using job evaluation to grade jobs, I would highly recommend you use it to improve the accuracy and robustness of the market benchmarking. So I think all of the structures that we looked at warrant job evaluation. 9 times out of 10, I would say analytical job evaluation. It's simply, it is the best approach. It's the most robust. It's the most reliable. It's also transparent. You can explain to employees easily how it works and so on. Some organizations maybe view it as overly bureaucratic and time consuming. I get that. And it might, they might not feel it's right for them. And therefore the other choice is about non-analytical job evaluation. And this essentially, this is about creating sort of maybe profiles. So, each of your grades might have a profile and you just match the job to that profile. Or maybe there's some anchor roles and you use those anchor roles to match it in. So the role of job evaluation, very important. I'd say more often than not, I'd recommend analytical job evaluation, but appreciate it might not always be right. So, you can come up with a non-analytical scheme. Market alignments, we talked about this at the beginning, didn't we? So this consists of 2 things. Now, quite often people will, when they think about market alignment, they'll think about market position. We want to be a medium payer, we want to be an upper quartile payer. We actually talked, didn't we, at the end there, job families, you can have different market positions for different groups of jobs, as long as you can rationalize that. So that's one aspect of it. But before you actually get to the market position, you want to define, well, what are your market or markets? So market definition is primarily about understanding where employees are typically recruited from and where they typically go when they leave the organization. And most businesses operate in more than one market. So once you have an understanding of, your market definition, you can then go and get appropriate data and use that to help inform your market position. Now, your market position, let's say more often than not, people will choose the median. If you're using spot rates, and that's what you align the spot rate to, although you have to consider affordability at the same time. If you're looking at narrow grades, broad grades, or job families, then what you tend to do is your market position sits in the middle of your range. So you use market data to create the overall range for your grades, and you'd use the market median data specifically to create that range. And if you're sort of looking for a 50% wide range, you go 20% down from the middle and 20% up, because actually then when you look at the difference between the min and the max, that's 50% wide. So that is essentially kind of how you use the market position to create the ranges or inform your spot rates. Now, there's a misconception that a higher market position will get you a better upper quartile position will get you upper quartile people, upper quartile performance. It doesn't work like that. You still have to have rigorous and robust recruitment processes and all of those other things. But what it will do is it will increase the pool of people who will be attracted by your offer and decrease the pool of organizations that can match your offer. So it makes you more attractive ultimately and decreases the organizations that can match your offer. Won't guarantee you the best people though. You still need to make sure that you've got robust processes in place to do that. Managing pay progression. So most systems that we looked at, and I forgot to say this when we looked at the spot rates, one of the downsides, I suppose, of spot rates is that they don't provide any scope for pay progression really, because there's no range. So inevitably, the pay progression comes in the way of market uplifts. And I actually view that as pay progression. If an organization is looking at market data, annually, every 6 months, whatever it might be, and they're making adjustments. That is pay progression. It's market-based pay progression. However, I do appreciate that employees don't necessarily view it like that. They will view it as like there's no opportunity for them to progress their pay based on things like performance, for example. So I'm using performance because it's the obvious example. But so spot rates don't really provide scope for pay progression, but the others that we looked at do. Now, the basis for progression must be explicitly linked to an organization's strategy and values. This is a big question because not every system has to be based on performance, but it is usually a big question. It's usually a big question. It's one of the most common and one of the most debated, I suppose. So whether to have a direct, indirect, or no link to performance is an important consideration. But there are other choices. You can have skills-based pay, competency-based pay. You can have team-based pay. So there are other things to consider. But performance will always be in that mix, and it will always be an important consideration. And then people and systems capability is also an important consideration when it comes to pay progression. So let's use our example of performance related pay. Let's say you decide you do want a performance related pay system. Managers have to be capable of operating in that system, and you also have to, when I say systems, I'm talking about processes and not electronic systems or IT systems, but it's about your processes and practices and so on. And you also need a robust performance management system. So again, don't implement performance related pay if you don't have the internal capability to make it work. So that's sort of just around pay progression. So once you've, that's essentially the creation step or the create step of the design phase. Once you've done that, essentially when you get to this stage, you'll have, I suppose, a proposed draft. And what you want to do in the testing phase, and I said before, it's very important, is that you want to model the proposed pay structure to assess the impact on costs. Costs very important, but also importantly, how the structure will work in practice. So you want to run different scenarios to understand, okay, if somebody comes in at the bottom of the range, how long will it take them to get to the middle of the range? And is that quick enough, or is that too quick? If it's not quick enough, because the reason I say the middle of the range, that's built around your market position, and usually, within a few years, you want most people to be in line with that if they're developing well. If it's not quick enough, then they might leave. So a lot of organizations don't run those scenarios, and they get to pay review time, or they're a couple of pay reviews down the road, and they go, oh, people aren't moving through quickly enough. Well, if you test it, then you can try and stop that from happening. collect and analyze feedback. It's amazing how many organizations don't actually go and say, okay, this is our proposed pay structure, and then they go and don't collect feedback from managers and employees. Most likely managers are going to be the ones operating that system, day to day, and obviously employees are on the receiving end. So they'll come up, they'll provide you with very, very useful feedback. Now, you'd adjust it based on the modeling and feedback, confirm the financial and organizational impacts of the proposed pay structure, ensure the pay structure complies with legal requirements, and then conduct the final review with key stakeholders to obtain approval. So this is really important. Before you get to implement, which is the next step, you want to make sure that it's rigorously tested. Which brings us to the last slide in the last phase. So the delivery phase, which is about implement and monitor. So obviously you need to develop a comprehensive project plan. This usually represents a significant amount of change for an organization. And you want to make sure that change is managed well. So you want to make sure that you've got a project plan, you communicate effectively. If appropriate and or possible, you may roll out in phases. We've seen organizations do that. It provides organizations with an opportunity to, again, test it on a certain part of the organization, monitor and gather feedback, evaluate the pay structure to ensure it's effective. So you will have some aims, won't you, with your pay structure? Some of the specific aims are you might want to align people with the strategy. You want to improve retention. You want to improve the quality of candidates that you attract. All of those sorts of things. All of those things are measurable, so you can measure the effectiveness of your pay structure. And if it's not meeting your targets or your measures, then you may need to adjust as needed. And then, of course, there's continuous improvement and continuous monitoring. So, once you've done all that and once it's implemented, you want to make sure that you're continuously monitoring it and improving it as the business changes. So that brings us to the end of what I wanted to present. We're now going to have some time for questions. I hope you found that useful. But yeah, happy to take any questions that anybody has.
Thanks so much for that, Joe. That's really interesting and covered a lot of ground as well. And I think just when we're running HR workshops, a lot of these sorts of topics and issues come up, particularly the thing around the communication as well. I think that's one area I think a lot of organizations think about. Okay, we put a pay structure in. How can we get line managers to be, to make effective pay decisions? I suppose some of that's down to the design of it, but it's how can they, are there some ways that an organization can look to make, communicate things in a transparent way and help understanding it? I suppose that would be the first question.
Yeah, I think so, Tim. And actually, maybe that on the previous slide, it should have said communicate and educate, because there's the communication, and it's the traditional things that you can think of, like town hall meetings, team meetings, detailed documentation, intranet, infographics, and all of those sorts of things. But you're absolutely right. Depending on the structure, let's say that an organization is moving from having no pay performance to a pay performance system. You need to make sure that managers are trained sufficiently to be able to operate in that system. And you also need to educate employees about how that system works as well. So I think that actually it's about communication and education. And quite often there needs to be, training guides. You can run interactive workshops, all of those sorts of things is very, very important, particularly if it represents quite a big change from where the organization is coming from.
No, okay, no, that's really helpful. Thanks, Joe. I've got a question. Michelle actually said she's worked with a non-analytical system in the past, and the provider at the time was adamant that the system was, their system was defensible in an ET. Do you know where that's? Do you know of any cases where that has happened? I suppose where people have used a non-analytical system and it's been,
Not to my knowledge, Tim.
Yeah.
As far as I'm aware, if you want to use job size as a defence to an equal pay claim in an employment tribunal, it needs to be a proper robust analytical job evaluation scheme. You can't use like a slotting scheme or like profiles, which is on the non-analytical side. It needs to be an analytical job evaluation scheme.
Okay, no, That's fine. It needs to be robust, doesn't it? Essentially,
Yeah.
so or you prove that your decisions are robust. So, Catherine asked, would narrow grades be based on job evaluation? So one grade for like a pay data grade or a Hay grade or a Willis
Yeah.
Towers grade. Yeah,
They
is that
would,
right?
yeah, they would. So I think that if you're gonna, because each grade contains, jobs the same size, then I think that if you're going to go down the narrow grade route, then it would be very hard not to choose an analytical job evaluation scheme to use in conjunction with that, because you know creating profiles for each of those levels would take quite a lot of time to differentiate, and it just wouldn't be as robust. So yeah, that's absolutely right. That more, it is, if you choose narrow grades, and each of those grades contains jobs of equal value, then it really should be accompanied by an analytical job evaluation scheme.
No, okay, no, that's fine. Thank you. Can you run from Jenny? This is can you run a payment structure alongside a benefit structure? Can they complement complement each other at all? Do you know?
I'm not sure I understand that question. Does that mean, like, can you overlay benefits onto the grades and things? I'm
I
not.
suppose it would be, wouldn't it? I suppose yes.
So
That's how I'd
absolutely, yeah.
interpret it.
So if you, and by the way, if I'm answering, Jenny, if I'm answering this question wrong, you can see my contact details on the screen. So feel free to drop me an email if I've totally missed the point here. So forgive me if I have. But obviously, I was talking about pay, predominantly talking about pay and pay progression and how to structure pay. But the grades themselves can also be used to overlay benefits. We did touch on career development as well, but the grades can also provide useful foundations for career developments. You can overlay competency framework. So even though the focus has been on pay today, the grades themselves can be very useful in other ways.
Okay. Uh, Thanks. We've got lots of questions. We've got lots of questions, by the way. So I think we'll probably run out of time, and we'll have to answer them and send them out afterwards.
Yeah, we'll
But
send them all out. We'll
you
definitely
know,
answer everyone.
But next one from Tracy. What approach is generally taken when implementing a new structure and some existing employees' salaries are identified as being above the pay bands? Yeah,
Yeah, sure.
it's quite common, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very common. So like that, as part of the modeling and testing, that's where you would identify those things. And if let's just assume you've created these new pay ranges, and employees are over the top. You could take like a blanket view that they will get no pay rise, for example, until such time as they fall back within the range. Because as part of having a pay structure, the ranges are usually periodically updated, usually every year, so they do move in line with the market. So people that are over the top of the range, depending on how far they're over, will sometimes fall back in line. Some organizations say, it depends how many there are, there's a cost impact. But if there's a handful, and the people are, the organization wants to really retain them and they're good people, so they're trying to balance the needs, affordability and the needs of the organization with employees, they might give something the equivalent non-consolidated to the employee. Sometimes organizations vary it. Now you have to be very careful with this, so sometimes they might say, we're not going to give that person anything, but we're going to give this person non-consolidated. And if it's based on legitimate, reasonable factors such as performance and stuff, that's okay. But you do have to be very, very careful if you are going to sort of take sort of one approach with one employee. It's I suppose a discretionary, differentiated approach. But those tend to be the main ways, really. Sort of nothing until they fall back in, maybe something non-consolidated, or again, depending on how many employees it is, how much it is. Some employees might continue to give a pay rise if they're just over the top of the pay range. Again, they might use their discretion, but it needs to be. What I would say is that whatever you do, it needs to be clearly laid out in your policy, that it's clear, the process is clear and transparent to everybody, and it sort of doesn't, flip and flop and change. You need to be able to justify your decisions, and you need to be comfortable, explaining to the employee as well.
That's really, yeah, exactly. Back to communication, isn't it? And being clear of things. We've got lots of questions about overlapping grades, about getting the balance between pay and bonus right, and things like that. So, but I'm conscious that we sort of said about a hard stop. People have got other things to move on. So we'll answer all the questions which people provided. Send that out with the slides as well. And then obviously, as Joe said, if you've got any other questions and advice, questions you want to ask us, please do get in touch. I hope you found it really useful, and thanks again so much, Joe, for your time, and thanks for joining. As I said, do get in touch if you've got any questions, and we'll hopefully see you next time. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a good rest of the week as well. So take care, everyone.
Thanks for joining, everybody.
Bye. Bye now.